correctly, defense mechanisms that grow up out of this portion of the iceberg that we're calling the unconscious mind, they protect our conscious self in ways that can be adaptive or that can be maladaptive. In other words, defenses can be healthy or they can be unhealthy.
Yes.
And perhaps in a few minutes we can get into what a healthy versus an unhealthy defense looks like. But the way you described character structure sounds to me like an array of contextual dispositions. I don't want to add unnecessarily complex language, but it sounds to me like a bunch of dispositions. Like if I'm walking into the office where I know everybody and I see familiar faces, there's no reason for me to be on guard if I trust those people. But if I'm walking down a street at night that I'm not familiar with and I'm starting to get the sense that, this neighborhood might not be the best, it makes sense for me to be on relatively high alert. So different dispositions depending on different conditions. I can't help but mention my bulldog, Costello, who had basically 3 dispositions. It was asleep, but in all seriousness, the second one was kind of bored. The bulldog face was kind of bored, or if something was given to him that he liked, or if we were doing something he liked, delight. He basically had 3 dispositions as far as I could tell. I think one of the reasons we like dogs so much, or that many of us like dogs so much, is that their decisions are very predictable. Take him to the park, he's happy, unless he happened to be ill that day, which was rare. Feed him, he's happy, right? There wasn't a lot of, I don't like this particular meal, or I don't like this particular park, or this Bichon Frise doesn't smell so good to me. Right. It was so simple. And yet people are very complex, right? I can look at myself and say, okay, what is my character structure? Character structure is certain things I like, certain things I dislike, certain things really irritate me, certain environments and people I just delight in. Okay, so is the definition of a healthy character structure one in which the dispositions match the context perfectly? I mean, I don't know how any of us could be like that, but is that sort of the ideal, much in the same way that, we could probably arrive at an ideal degree of stamina that one could have? I mean, some people run ultra marathons, 100 miles or more. Some people want to run a marathon. Some people like me don't really desire to run a marathon, but I want to be able to run a mile if I need to without being completely exhausted and injured. So, when we ask ourselves about character structure, are we asking ourselves about context-driven dispositions? And how do we start to evaluate that for ourselves?
Right. I think because we're more complicated, I think it's not dispositions as much as it's predispositions, right? So in the example that you gave, right, you have a certain predisposition to be either trusting or wary, right? And that's healthy in you, right? So when you come into a setting where there's not a good reason to feel mistrustful, to feel anxious, to feel vulnerable, right? Then you feel at ease, right? So you walk into the work setting, there are people you know, there are people you like, everything is okay, right? You have a different predisposition when the context is different, right? So if the context could bring a lack of safety, then you respond accordingly with the lack of safety, right? But it's possible, certainly, those predispositions can be in unhealthy places, right? So, for example, you might have been traumatized in a certain way, or you might approach the world in a certain way because of prior experience that you may not register as trauma, but it may be that within you is a predisposition to be mistrustful. So you could walk into a room of people that you know, of people who've never meant you any harm, and still feel unsafe, right? Now, this happens most often after trauma, but there are other ways people can get to that where the predisposition isn't so healthy. The converse is true too, right? There are people who can have too much of what's called an omnipotence defense, and then they don't recognize danger when danger is around them. So the idea, the character structure, that nest, right, that's built around the defensive structure and the conscious mind that's sitting on top of the part of the iceberg, the unconscious mind underwater, right? It's that nest that is interfacing with the world through a whole set of predispositions.
I'd like to take a brief break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, AG1. AG1 is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that meets all of your foundational nutrition needs. I started taking AG1 way back in 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. The reason I started taking AG1 and the reason I still take AG1 once or generally twice per day is that it's the easiest way for me to ensure that I'm getting all of the vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and fiber that I need in my diet. Now, of course, it's essential to get proper nutrition from whole foods, but most people, including myself, find it hard to get enough servings of fruits and vegetables each day, and especially to get enough prebiotics and probiotics to ensure gut health. As you may know, your gut contains trillions of little microbiota, the so-called gut microbiome, which establishes critical connections with other organs of your body to enhance brain health, as well as to support your immune system and other aspects that relate to mental and physical health. One of the most common questions I get is, if you were to take just one supplement, which supplement would that be? And my answer is always AG1, because by taking AG1, I'm able to ensure that I'm getting all of the vitamins, minerals, and probiotics that I need to enhance my mental health, physical health, and performance. If you'd like to try AG1, go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. They'll give you 5 free travel packs, and they'll give you a year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim this special offer. I think most of us are familiar with assessing and assigning names to the character structures of others. And at least for most of us, we do that with no professional training or authority, right? We say, that person is great. They're super nice. The person's a jerk. They're like weird, et cetera, et cetera. I think very few of us are familiar with assessing our own character structure.
Right.
And I have to presume that some of what happens when somebody comes to you as a psychiatrist or to a psychologist is that certain questions are asked and certain narratives are told that start to reveal to the clinician the character structure. And perhaps from there, some of the possible defense mechanisms and structure of the person's unconscious mind and conscious mind that obviously are unaware to them, but would be clear to the clinician. Much in the same way that if somebody goes into the doctor and says, I don't feel well, they're going to start probing with questions, or they're going to put, listen to their breathing, listen to their heart, right? I mean,
Get out the stethoscope and figure it out.
These are the probes, whereas the psychiatrist or psychologist uses words and language to probe.
Yes.
So what are the sorts of aspects of character structure that we can be aware of in ourselves? In other words, should we be asking, what type of character do I have, dependent on one circumstance or another? Should we ask ourselves what sorts of defenses we have? And maybe this would be a good opportunity to address this issue of what are healthy versus unhealthy defenses. Because it sounds to me, if I understand correctly, that the defense mechanisms are a very strong component in determining what our character structure is.
Right, because the defense mechanisms are unconscious, right? The character structure that nest around the defenses in the conscious mind through which we interface with the world, right, is very, very complicated. So there are as many character structures as there are human beings, right? So it's very, very complicated, but there are factors that are consistently relevant across people and get identified as such. So one example would be isolation versus affiliation, right? So does a person tend to group with others, right? Or does the person tend to avoid grouping, right? And go about thoughts, tasks, approaches to life in a more singular manner, right? So it's just one element. I'm not making value judgment about it, because it can be good or bad on either end of the spectrum, right? So we're just saying, what are the factors? So am I more affiliative, or do I tend to isolate and be more singular? That's just one example, right? Another example could be things like, for example, use of humor, right? Does a person use humor, and in what way, right? Does a person use humor to deflect discomfort in negative situations? Does a person use humor in order to belittle others or to belittle themselves? Or does a person not use humor, right? So there are these aspects of character structure, and so much research has been done on this over the years to determine what is most salient, right, in this thing that we use in order to interface with the world around us, out of which grows our self.
That makes good sense. And it makes me want to revise a little bit what I asked about before, which is, I said that when it comes to an exam of physical health, we measure blood pressure, measure breathing, et cetera, maybe even a blood test, look at some biomarkers. But what you're describing is a little bit more analogous to the physician addressing a patient who's having some physical discomfort or malaise and saying, tell me about your day. What do you do when you get up in the morning? If the person says, well, I drink a quarter pint of vodka, it's a very different answer than, I go outside and get sunlight in my eyes, drink a glass of water, and maybe have a cup of coffee, right?
Right.
Or if somebody says, I have six espresso. If I understand correctly, the character structure is better revealed by exploring the action states that somebody engages in, isolation versus engagement, as opposed to a read of one specific biomarker.
Yes. It's
so
character structure brought to life, right? Yes.
Immediately I'm thinking about movies and books where we learn so much about somebody through observing the way that they interact with people in very, very potent ways. So for instance, I can think of countless movies where you learn a ton about somebody in the first scene simply because of the way they react to somebody who, cuts them off in traffic. They just explode. Okay, well then we think of that person as reactive from that point on, unless there's a significant amount of material to revise that. But it's in the action of getting explosive and cursing, et cetera, as opposed to if they just kind of laugh it off or laugh at themselves or blame someone within their own vehicle or something like that. So are those the sorts of things that a clinician like yourself is listening for when somebody says, I don't feel well, and you say, well, tell me about what's going on lately, and they start describing what's going on in their life? And are you listening for those places where the defense mechanisms start to reveal themselves? The character structure starts to reveal itself through these action steps that the person seems to be taking? Is it?
Yeah. I mean, maybe one way of looking at character structure is that it's potentialities and predispositions, right? That there's so much that's latent that then interfaces with events, like a person stuck in traffic. How does that person respond? If that person weren't stuck in traffic, there wouldn't be a response to it, right? So there are potentialities, there are predispositions, and then we live through enacting them as we're moving then through life, right? And the attempts to understand, using the physical health parallel, right? If you came in and you said, I don't feel well, right? We might run a lot of tests, right? We might get an MRI or a CAT scan or even putting the stethoscope and listening to what's inside of you. Those, we could say, are unconscious things. Like, you're not aware of what the imaging may show or the blood test may show or how your lungs may sound when someone puts a stethoscope on them, right? So a clinician, if you're trying to understand and help someone, then you do want to look for those things, right? You want to look for the things that are underneath the surface, but that can be very, very important, right? You also want to look at everything that's on the surface, right? So if you're engaging with someone, you're engaging with the self, right? The self that grows out of the character structure nest, right? So by engaging with and doing one's best to understand the self, then you learn about what is underneath of it, right? So I may then learn, well, how do you respond in certain situations, right? Just like I could ask you questions, well, when do you not feel well? Or, right? So you're asking a person questions because the idea is to understand elements of the character structure. So how do you respond in certain situations? What's going on inside of you, right? What do you understand about yourself and what do you not understand about yourself, right? How do you bring yourself to bear in the world around you? So there's a similar process going on, but here we're trying to understand the self, and the understanding of the self can help us understand the components underneath of the self, because that's where we're going to go to make things better, right? The idea is there shouldn't have to be mystery, or certainly not mystery any more than there is in physical health. I mean, rarely someone comes in and they're really not feeling well, and a whole set of everything that should be done is done, right? Labs, physical examination, history, imaging, right? And you still just don't know, right? I mean, sometimes that can happen, but it's very rare. And the same should apply here, that if we're examining a self, right, and we're looking for the components out of which that self comes, right, then we should be able to understand well enough to go back to the components of self and to make change so that the self is in a better place, right? And that self can then be empowered, can feel humility, right? Can then come at life through the altruism and gratitude that we seek. Because again, you show me someone who's coming at life through altruism and gratitude and is not happy with their life, and you'll be showing me something I've never seen before, something entirely new. So if we want to get there, we want to know how to get there. And there are ways, as there should be, that parallel physical health that aren't mysterious that we can come at to make understanding and change.
I'm wondering about the role of anxiety in all of this. The reason I ask about anxiety is that you said that so much of character structure is determined by a set of predispositions and potentialities.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier we were talking about the example of either being afraid or unafraid in particular environment.